Thanks so much for joining me as we continue on in our series on habits of grace. Before we get started with the lesson tonight, I just want to start by giving a big shout out to all of you who have been working so faithfully, whether it was last week in the soccer camp. I know we had probably 20 or more teens that were there serving between the missions team and many of you others who came out and served, as well as those who are serving in backyard VBSs this week. So even though we're not doing our teaching live, I hope you're still getting a chance to watch these videos and then joining in our discussions on Wednesday night. And I'm excited as we continue to study how constantly applicable these topics are. So tonight, we're actually going to be taking a look as we continue on talking about prayer in our series, Habits of Grace. We're going to be looking specifically at transforming anxiety into peace through prayer. The reality is all of us who are honest, and myself included, deal with anxiety. It's not something that we dealt with oftentimes, but it's something that we deal with maybe on a weekly, monthly, or for some of us even on a daily basis. And so I want to just talk about how prayer can transform anxiety into peace. And hopefully you'll find this lesson very practical. So kind of kicking off the beginning of our discussion here, I want to first just simply define anxiety a little bit, okay? So, we can go a whole bunch of different directions with this. I did a bit of research with different definitions that were out there, but just ended up going with dictionary.com. And here's how they defined anxiety and kind of a work off of this a little bit. Distress or uneasiness of mind caused by fear of danger or misfortune. We can feel anxious about ourselves. We can feel anxious about our friends. Maybe you feel anxious about your family. I know for me, I think a lot about my kids or my wife. And it can cause physical distress, right? There are times where you can even have anxiety just be so strong that it's overwhelming. You don't feel like you can do anything. Sometimes it's just mental. Maybe you're anxious and people don't even know you're anxious, right? There's this uneasiness because of a fear you have about something that is a potential danger or misfortune that could happen. So, as we think about it, it can be really overwhelming to feel anxious sometimes. And I know most people, given the opportunity to say, would you rather feel anxious or not feel anxious? We're going to say yeah, I don't want to feel anxious. I don't like this feeling, right? I want to have freedom. I want to have joy. I want to experience peace in my life. And so it's often something that is triggered when we feel powerless. Guys, I've really specifically been struggling with a lot of anxiety over the last couple of weeks as soccer camp and missions trip came up last week. And then just all the different moving parts of that, especially in the middle of the pandemic. Maybe you guys have felt your anxiety rising because of the uncertainty of everything. What's school going to look like this fall? How's your job going to be affected? Your family, your home, your social life and all the things, when is the youth group going to go back to meeting in person instead of on video? All those different kinds of questions, right? But ultimately, I think the point where concern crosses over into anxiety is when we feel this desire to want to control the outcome of something, but don't feel like we have the capacity to do it. It feels, we get this sort of sense of powerlessness. We don't know something. We're concerned about what we don't know or what could happen, the unknown. So I think those are just a few of the things that can often trigger into anxiety. Certainly a lot more that could be said, but just kind of to start the discussion, specifically as it applies to thinking about prayer. So as we go to that, I want to look, if you've got your Bibles, turn with me. We're going to look at two passages tonight as we think about how to transform anxiety into peace and how prayer is the tool that God uses for that. The first thing I want to look at is, as we look at responding to anxiety, is recognizing, let's read the passage, then we'll look at it. Read along with me if you can. Psalm 127, we're just going to look at verses 1 and 2. And here's what it says. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest. I felt this last week at missions trip. I'm sure the other 14 of us, or the 14 of you that were there, know what I mean, right? Eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives sleep to his beloved, right? Rest comes only through Jesus, not through our hard work and our toil. So one of the first things I want to recognize about anxiety and how it should affect our prayer life is oftentimes we should ask this question when we're faced with a situation. What is my responsibility in the matter? Okay. So I want you to see here, there's a really clear responsibility that's given to each of the people described in verses 1 and 2. The first one is, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. But what the text doesn't say is God's the only one that's allowed to build houses. All the other builders need to stop, right? The point is, no, the builder is called to labor. He is called to work. But he needs to determine what is his responsibility and what is not his responsibility. Okay, so in this passage, we see a couple things that each of these people are called to be responsible to. Okay, the watchman is called to stay awake. That is his responsibility. The worker is called to work. Now, not anxiously, but he is in fact called to work. And so we see these are the three things that they're called to. But I want you to also see, what is our responsibility in a situation? Well, I can tell you one thing that we are called to do in every situation is to be vessels of love. We are to pour out God's love on the people around us. And so no matter what the context is, that's one thing I can tell you that we are always called to do, is to love the people around us. The other thing is we are called to pray. We are called to bring our concerns before God and to pray for people, pray for situations, pray for things that seem out of our control, because we know we can trust God in those things. So let's look at what's not in our control. And oftentimes where we get ourselves into trouble is we take up responsibility for things that God doesn't want us to take up responsibility for. They're things that are out of our hands, right? So with verse 1, right? Look at the builder. The builder is not responsible for how big the storm is that hits his house. He may do everything right and may build a great foundation, may use all the best materials, but ultimately he can't control the calamity that that house may face. He can't control whether an earthquake's going to come, a fire, whatever that may be. The other thing is, look at the watchman. He is called to stay awake, but he has no control over how big the army is or how wise or foolish the foe is that may come up against the city. And thirdly, you see this other person has no control over what tomorrow holds, right? The worker is called to work, but to understand that in his working, he can't actually control the outcome of what's going to happen tomorrow, if he's going to have bread or not have bread. And in the same way, we are called to be responsible for our actions, but know that other people are outside the realm of our responsibility. God doesn't call us to be responsible for how other people respond, for what other people say, for the decisions that they make. And oftentimes we can feel anxious when we think about those things, right? We want someone to respond a certain way, whether to us or to another situation. Maybe you carry the burden for a friend who's just not making good decisions, and your heart is just breaking. You want them to make the right choice, but it just seems like they keep making bad choices. We can't be anxious about those things. God didn't call us to be responsible for those. He called us to pray for them and to love them through those situations and to speak truth into those situations. So just looking first and foremost here at discerning what is our responsibility in the matter and what is not our responsibility. And that's a good sort of checkpoint for anxiety, right? Hold on, I'm feeling really anxious. Am I anxious because of something God's called me to do? Or am I anxious about something that I'm taking responsibility for that he didn't intend for me to carry? So that's part of it, okay? The other thing I think, and probably the more significant, is I want to look at Philippians 4. This is a really common passage. Maybe even some of you have this memorized. If you haven't, I would encourage you to memorize this, as this passage is really significant to bring to mind when you're dealing with anxiety, okay? And this passage really teaches us about learning to unburden our hearts. So look with me as we look at responding to anxiety, what that looks like. There we go. Sorry, forgot those two slides. So Philippians 4 through 7. Here's what it says. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So, as we think about unburdening our hearts, having that freedom, right? Listen to that last part. Anybody who's ever dealt with anxiety before, which is probably all of you, or nearly all of you, peace of God guarding our hearts and minds. Isn't that what you want when you're anxious? To just be able to take that deep breath, to be able to know everything is going to be okay. How do we get there? What does that look like? Well, we're gonna take a look, kind of walk through this verse and see some really specific things that I think are outlined here. Okay. First thing I want you to see is rejoicing. We're called to rejoice. There's always something to be thankful for and to be joyful about. We are called to give thanks. And oftentimes when we're anxious, we're not thinking about what we can give thanks for. Probably about a year ago, I think, or 9 months ago in youth group, we went through this passage last fall and talked about the fact that scientists have discovered that physiologically, the brain can only have two responses that can't happen simultaneously. And one is thankfulness, and the other one is anxiety. And so like they've actually measured the neuron bridges and all the other crazy stuff that I'm probably using the wrong terms if any of you are going into med school, but that essentially the two things, both thankfulness and anxiety, can't happen at the same time. That nerve response is not capable. And so the first thing we see is this attitude of thanksgiving and rejoicing should be really key. And the reality is there are always things, even the most bleak of situations, that we can give thanks to God for and rejoice. And so we're called, no matter what the situation is, not whether we feel like it or not whether it's convenient or not whether it's easy or not, but in all situations to rejoice. And by the way, I want to remind you of where Paul was at when he wrote Philippians. He was rotting in a prison cell, okay? So Paul wasn't writing this from this posh, comfortable bed where things were good. He was writing out of a position of suffering. He got how difficult things were. And his call was that we should rejoice in any and every situation. And so we need to know that Paul not only is calling us to something, but he modeled the same kind of attitude that he's calling us to. Next thing I want you to see in the passage is this word reasonableness, right? You look back, it says, let your reasonableness be known to all, or known to everyone. So this idea of reasonableness could also be translated gentleness. And really kind of looking at this word is it has to do with what is fitting. Our attitude really should reflect that we are making the important things the priority, okay? We're not getting caught up in things that don't matter. We're really keeping our eyes focused on the priorities. And so when we're dealing with anxiety, sometimes what happens is we begin focusing on things that either A, are not our responsibility, they're God's responsibility, or B, we just start making things really big and out of hand that shouldn't be. We're focusing on maybe details or potential things that could happen or what ifs that really don't show that our focus is on the right things and that God is the one that we trust and that we believe in him. The other thing here is this idea of the Lord is at hand. So this really needs to shape everything we do. Do we recognize that at any moment Jesus could come back? How does that affect our anxiety? What if Jesus came back? There have been times, maybe you've been this way, you've been so anxious and I'm like, oh Lord, I can't face tomorrow. Would you just come back today? That would be great, because then I wouldn't have to deal with tomorrow, right? Probably not the right reason to pray for Jesus to return. My prayer should be, Jesus, glorify your name. Come back at the time when you will receive the most glory, not please make my life comfortable and easy. But the reality is, if we're thinking about the Lord being at hand, it should influence how we respond to situations. And the other thing to recognize with this is, especially when Jesus comes back, we will see him as the righteous judge who's going to make all things right. And so him coming back means that we don't have to worry about settling out the world's injustices. Maybe you're anxious about somebody who's been taken advantage of, or who's in a bad situation, or even your own life. You're in a tough spot and you just want to know why where's God? Why isn't he answering? And what I want you to recognize here is that when we think about the fact that the Lord is in hand, the judge is going to set the record straight. Those injustices will be silenced and we will see him bring justice finally about. The next phrase we see here is that when we're tempted to be anxious, we need to recognize this as a call to pray, okay? And probably most of us don't feel this way. We're like, thanks, Lord, for these feelings of anxiety. It makes me really want to pray. No, like, just make these feelings of anxiety go away, right? But look at the passage. It says, do not be anxious in anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, right? So what are we to replace anxiety with? Well, anxiety, we're called to replace with prayer and supplication, okay? So when we feel anxious, it should actually call us to prayer. We're called to replace anxiety with prayer, that we are to throw ourselves, when we feel helpless, right, which is oftentimes what triggers anxiety. Either we don't know or we can't do something. We are not omniscient, we're not all-knowing, or we're not omnipresent. We can't be everywhere all at once, or we're not omnipotent, we're not all-powerful. Those things are often what trigger anxiety. Those are a call for us to lean on Christ through prayer, to ask for his help, okay? The last thing I want to point out here is that supplication must be mixed with thanksgiving, right? You look through the end of the verse there. But in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be made known to God. Thanksgiving is so important, because otherwise what will happen if we begin to focus so much on the problem, we will lose sight of God in all of it. And Thanksgiving draws us back to God. It puts our focus on Him, on the wonder of who He is, the power that He has displayed in our lives. And so we're called to make sure that Thanksgiving is crucial. Otherwise, it just becomes treating God like a genie. Do this for me, do this for me, do this for me. But Thanksgiving says, thank you for what you have done already for me. Thank you for what you are doing in this present situation as well. Ultimately then, sorry, we'll jump back here. The last thing I want you to see is that peace comes when we recognize that God bears the burden. This gives us freedom, right? And it talks about the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds, right? Our understanding is limited, but the peace of God comes from knowing that He knows everything. He is all powerful. Nothing can thwart or His purposes or plans. God doesn't ever mess up. He doesn't get frustrated or fail. And so when we come and cast our anxieties on Him, we can experience the freedom of having His peace guard our hearts, because we know that everything is working out for His glory, not necessarily for our comfort or our ease of life, but for His glory, and we can lean on that. So here's the discussion question we're going to be covering on Wednesday night. This is an interesting diagram, and I want you to kind of think about this, okay? So anxiety is a result of concern about something, right? Legitimate concern mixed with unbelief, okay? So, and that is where anxiety comes from. And so if we have a legitimate concern, maybe you're concerned about the health of someone, you're concerned about the choices someone's making, the choices you have to make, or something upcoming, but unbelief has to do with not actually putting our trust in God, right? We're going to face anxiety. Inner peace comes from taking that same concern and pairing it with faith, okay? So we recognize that, first of all, as we deal with anxiety, it doesn't mean we just get rid of our emotions, right? I just don't feel anything anymore. What it means is that we take concern and we pair it with faith, and that's where peace comes from. So here's my questions for you. 2 questions. What things do you struggle with not believing God about, okay? What are those areas in your life where you just realize, man, God, are you really good? Or maybe just, God, are you really all powerful? Do you really know what you're doing? Because it doesn't feel like it. I feel like I would do a better job, right? If you've ever felt that way before, that's unbelief. And the second question, kind of paired with that, what would it look like to exercise faith in those areas? So what are the areas specifically for you that you struggle with not believing God? And what would it look like for you to exercise faith in those areas? I hope you guys will join us on Wednesday night. Look forward to more discussion about this, and just praying that God uses this lesson as you study His Word to encourage you and to grow you in your walk with Him. Thanks so much, guys.